Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the library. We're delighted that you could come out on this lovely spring day where the April showers are preparing for the May flowers, and I trust nobody had any problem with parking. I didn't know if I should hum a little Mozart to kind of calm everybody down, you know, and do a little musical therapy, which I understand is part of the talk today. So I tried to find something good to say about this, and it is quite a going topic. There were recent articles in Scientific American and even more up-to-date breaking news in that august scientific publication, Cosmopolitan magazine, that suggested that this had some very beneficial effects, and I certainly hope we will have those. So I want to, on behalf of the library, welcome you to the program. I'm Bruce Farrar. I'm the Branch Services Administrator, which, as I've said before, means I'm in charge of all the parking lots in the system except the one for this building. Okay. Just wanted to clear that up. And welcome you on behalf of the Mayor Bill Purcell and the members of the Metropolitan Council, from Library Director Donna Nicely and the members of the Metropolitan Library Board. We are delighted that you are here. We are also extremely delighted, as always, to have with us Vanderbilt University, who not only brings us intellectual sustenance, but also the lunch. I wanted to say something about Mozart and the lunches, but I tried to find some Mozart jokes, and I found some jokes by him, but I found out that most of his humor was of the rather earthy sort and not at all the best thing to do just before lunch, so I'm going to refrain from that and instead introduce from our host institution here, Beth Fortune, who is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Public Affairs for Vanderbilt University.
Bruce, I appreciate you trying to give me that promotion, but I think my boss would have something to say about that. So, well, on behalf of Vanderbilt, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this month's Thinking Out of the Lunchbox program. We're grateful to the Downtown Library and to Donna Nicely and to Bruce and everyone for their partnership in this series. It has been one of our most successful partnerships ever, and to gather in this world-class library to hear world-class thinkers like Greg and David, it just doesn't get any better for that, especially on a rainy afternoon. One of the great things about working at a university, and Vanderbilt in particular, is that every day we get to engage in the kind of intellectual conversations and debates that will be ongoing for the next hour. And we are delighted that we can bring these intellectual discussions to downtown, and I want to thank you for attending today, and I know you will go away fed physically and mentally. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce David Wood, who is the creator, the leader of this series. All things Thinking Out of the Lunchbox, David Wood does. David is professor of philosophy. What'd you say? David is a professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt, and he is truly one of our great thinkers and one of our most engaging faculty members. For those of you who are Lunchbox regulars, you know that he asks provocative questions and leads interesting discussions. And for you first-timers, I suspect that you will be back after you hear David and Greg. And again, thank you for attending today, and it's my pleasure to welcome Professor David Wood. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Beth, and thank you, Bruce, for welcoming us in out of the rain. And I'd like us also to extend special thanks to Mary Pat Teague for coordinating all these events every month. We are very lucky to have Greg Barz here today. I don't know if this is quite correct, but most of the people that I have met at Blair teach one instrument or another among all their other tasks, but Greg is different and special. He may teach instruments, but no, he doesn't. But he is an ethnomusicologist, And I came across him first at one of our big university events when Chancellor Guy had asked him to talk a little bit about his work in Africa, bringing music to those suffering from AIDS. And I was very taken by this short talk, and I thought it'd be wonderful to have him come and do something along those sort of lines to our lunchtime lecture series. Greg has taught in many other places before coming to Vanderbilt. He's taught in the University of Chicago, at Brown University, where he did his PhD. He has taught in Africa, in Tanzania, at the University of Dar es Salaam. He's taught in Canada, the University of Alberta, at Ohio State, where our dear Chancellor was once. And he's been at Blair since, what, 99? Or 98. And he is becoming one of the most visible members of the Blair School of Music. He's had Fulbright fellowships. He's the Ethnomusicology editor of the New Grove Dictionary of Music. He's the recording review editor of the World of Music, and he does lots and lots of research on the relationship between music and medicine. At Vanderbilt, he teaches all kinds of classes on African music, on jazz, blues, world music, and so on. We are delighted to have him here today, and I understand he has a PowerPoint presentation. I haven't mastered this art myself, but we're very much looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Thank you. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you, David, very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Beth and Bruce, for your introductory remarks, and thanks for plugging my article in Cosmo that you can all. I'm still waiting for the check on that one. I've spent a considerable amount of time living outside of the United States in the past few years, and during that time I've been thinking a lot about relationships, specifically about relationships that exist between peace and social justice. There are, of course, varying degrees and various types of peace in our world, and not just an inexplicable American conceptualization of peace. And I wonder if social justice is, if social justice is a social construction, then what about peace? Is peace also culturally determined? Is peace an invention, also a social product? I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking about this question as I prepared some comments today. Can there be different ways of understanding peace? Peace is often understood as a result of conflict, of aggression, and there is peace that resolves strife and hatred. Surely there is also a peace of the mind, a peace that exists in our mental world. And there must be a type of peace that emerges as a partner to our spirit. But for me today, what I'd like to question is whether there's also another way of understanding peace. I pose this question for reasons other than what might be immediately obvious, and primarily for a reason that is seldom addressed. I wonder if it would be useful for us to approach an understanding of peace as it exists within our body, within our very corporeal humanity, with who we are as people. As we all know, some people in our world today have access to varying degrees of peace within our bodies. Many are denied such peace due to cultural, economic, or political reasons. The limitations of peace of the body are definitely not natural. Rather, they reflect a lack of peace that is globally enforced and internationally embraced. During a visit several years ago to the village of Kibali Busiki in eastern Uganda, I noticed a woman approach the farm of Centurio Balikoa, my Ugandan research colleague, in a village where I was conducting field research. The woman carried a small akadongo, a musical instrument that's often referred to as a thumb piano. She had this instrument slung across her shoulder as she made her way along a pathway through banana fields leading from a neighboring village. Several hours later, as I concluded a recording session with the male village musicians, I noticed that the woman with the akdongo had joined the seated village residents listening to the impromptu performance. Before putting my recording equipment away, I asked Balikoa about the woman and her instrument. He shrugged his shoulders, saying that he was also curious because he had never heard, in his words, a lady akadongo player. Vilimina Nakiranda introduced herself to me. She introduced herself as the leader of the local women's group and asked if we would like to also record her and record her songs. As she accompanied herself, Vilimina sang a powerful series of songs in which she outlined ways women must fight back against AIDS, reclaim their health, and change their lives. Music is a powerful tool used today by women and youths in many areas of Uganda, both rural and urban. Studies of HIV/AIDS and musical performances in Africa are urgently needed in order to help guide and help direct funding agencies, relief workers, educators, and local non-governmental organizations concerning the power of localized forms of disseminating information. Women's groups, women's indemnity, and social groups in eastern Uganda fight an uphill battle on a daily basis against a fast-spreading disease. And for many already affected with HIV, time is running out. Women sing and dance and perform dramas during their group gatherings to introduce interventions that focus on gender issues specific to women and female youths. Many song texts warn against participating in risky behaviors, risky environments, or engaging in unprotected sexual behavior. Many songs also outline specific networks, social networks that are available from the greater community, including the availability of condoms and specific testing sites. Music is used by many of these groups to disseminate information, to mobilize social resources. to raise consciousness concerning issues related to AIDS. I believe that the critical responses by women such as Wilhelmina Nakiranda, in the form of musical performance, should be understood as a significant means of constructing practical approaches to AIDS prevention and AIDS education. The chance meeting I had with Wilhelmina opened many opportunities for me over the past 6 years to record, interview, and interact with women who gather in order to educate others and discuss issues related to HIV, AIDS treatment, care, and counseling in Uganda. This is not an uncommon phenomenon in East Africa. Such social groups are frequently formed, and they function in many ways as extended families, serving financial, educational, spiritual, and advisory roles. And they are frequently formed by and for women in villages and in cities. That many of these contemporary music groups in Uganda, such as Wilhelmina's home group, the Bakuseka Maja Women's Group, turn to musical performance, that is, music, dance, and drama, to increase the understanding of reproductive health and female sexuality and to promote the adoption of safer sex practices is not unusual in this area of the world. And there is a great and urgent need for documentation and further analysis and compassionate understanding of this performance tradition. No one will listen to us unless we bring our drums. No one will listen to us talk about Slim, AIDS, unless we dance. I sit in a small family compound in Bute village in the Busoga region of eastern Uganda, surrounded by banana trees, fields of cassava, and a dwindling coffee crop. I'm struck by the statement about drums made by Aida Namulinda, a farmer and leader of the local village women's music and dance ensemble with whom I've come to work. 2 Ugandan medical doctors accompany me, both of whom are involved with AIDS medical research in the nation's capital. While the doctors and I set up our recording equipment, Aida continues to mobilize her village's performing ensemble in order for our research team to document several of the group's songs and dramas. As the afternoon's music making begins, several men bring out a set of Chisoga xylophones, panpipes, tube fiddles, and drums from one of the huts to accompany the women of Aida's group as they summon and engage the community of farmers returning home from the fields. The women encourage everyone to gather, to sing, to dance, to listen to this group's messages concerning proper condom use, faithfulness to partners, and sexual abstinence. During a break, Aida continues her thoughts about music with me, asserting that whether by itself or incorporated within dance and music, songs are now embraced by village-based groups such as hers as the most effective and the most immediate means available for communicating and disseminating information pertaining to medical and healthcare concerns. As she returns to lead the group of women, Aida dramatizes a powerful series of songs outlining specific ways women can fight back against the spread of HIV and how they must reclaim their health and change their lives, even though they are all HIV positive. Aida was, in fact, singing for life. I would now like to introduce the sounds of the performers of Bute village, the small village in the eastern part of the country, and in particular Aida Namulinda, the group's leader. I'm going to play an audio example of Aida leading the villagers, and I provide a brief translation of a portion of the song text on your handout as example number 1.
Olumbe
Aida sings, "Let me explain it to you, friends. AIDS invades the body, it makes you fat. It finishes the people, the sweeper, the problem came for all. First you slim, then boils begin to spread out all over your body. Then the skin becomes filled with patches. Then the skin is covered with a rash. The skin is covered with houseflies. Then houseflies start to cover you. The disease has finished us. What shall we do to survive the disease? The disease of this kind is one of malice. AIDS does not discriminate, even if you are elderly. We must stop laughing." This brief excerpt from a much longer performance provides many medical details. In fact, a rather specific description of the physical manifestation of the onset of AIDS. Aida sings about how the HIV virus weakens the body and how AIDS, often referred to as the sweeper or the broom, finishes entire villages, eating its victims. Along with the clearly didactic approach adopted in Aida's songs, clearly she also intends to strike fear in her listeners and thus affect changes in social behavior. Aida, Namulinda, and many other women in villages and towns in Uganda use music, dance, and drama more than ever to engage aggressively the devastation the HIV virus has caused in their communities. In village life, women often raise multiple generations of orphan children and take care of sick and dying family members and neighbors while simultaneously planning for the inevitable need for similar health care and educational needs for themselves and for their offspring. With little and oftentimes no support from governmental agencies and local and foreign NGOs, women's groups now often turn to more traditional and demonstrably more effective means of communicating information and history in traditional Ugandan culture, music, for purposes of healing, care, counseling, and medical intervention. Uganda is at the center, the epicenter of the HIV/AIDS pandemic in terms of global consciousness and regarding local funding for research on the control and monitoring of fluctuations in infection rates. Testing, education, awareness, and treatment have become highly politicized, as demonstrated in President Yoweri Museveni's initiative to treat the virus and disease as an open secret. In this regard, the country has dealt aggressively with AIDS to a much greater extent than other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. According to latest figures from the CDC, more than 400,000 people have died from the disease since first diagnosed in the country in 1984. Yet another 2 million are infected with the virus, according to census information by the WHO. At one time, these figures represented approximately 30% of Uganda's total population. Current infection rates claim a lowering to 5% overall. The WHO estimates that over 1.7 million children have been orphaned since the spread of HIV began. There are now approximately 1 million children living without parents, representing 8% of the total population in Uganda. But by introducing these data, I inevitably fall into the trap of reducing AIDS in Uganda to statistics, to rises and declines in infection rates, to discussions of lack of funding initiatives. If my field research, ongoing work has challenged me about anything, it's the need to put a human face on what is all too often thought to be a medical issue, at least a medical issue as we know it, or merely an opportunity to develop statistical procedures. In my own work, I found it useful, for example, to ground my analyses in lived experience, in human relationships, understanding the individual agency of many women and men working to provide indigenous and meaningful medical interventions in Uganda challenges me to avoid the tendency to reduce human conditions to mere measurements. In direct response, I'd like to share with you now a series of images that introduces and intentionally pays homage to several people with whom I've been privileged to work. Each individual has devoted much of their lives, in several cases what's left of their lives, to fighting AIDS through education, counseling, and most importantly through music. The first series you'll see is a group of herbalists, doctors, traditional healers, or self-proclaimed witch doctors, all of whom have adapted their healing techniques to take into account recently acquired knowledge of the spread of the virus, most in response to an organization called THETA, Traditional Healers Together Against AIDS. The second series includes women who have started village and urban health initiatives on their own, in which music, dance, and drama are primary means of disseminating health care information. And the third group you'll see, third group of images, illustrates men and women and youths who have not given up hope on the country's children. I should mention that all of the images you see today were taken by a Vanderbilt student who accompanied me to Uganda several years ago, Jonathan Rogers. I lied. Several of those shots were taken by my wife, Mona, who's in the audience, and I'm sorry that I did not give credit, but I saw, what was I thinking? The best shots were, of course, taken by Mona. I do have to go home tonight. In a conversation with Maboni Nabanji, the self-proclaimed witch doctor in the photograph, whenever I meet him, he says, "Stop calling me a traditional healer. I'm a witch doctor. You know, that just call me as you see." Okay, Maboni Nabanji, a respected witch doctor in Busoga, when I asked him what form treatment took in his medical practice, he said, "Treatment? We sing. Singing," and I put this on your handout, "singing is the main form of treatment we employ. We play drums and other instruments during the process of diagnosis to discern whether a patient has AIDS, familial spirits, or other possession. When we sing our songs, we burn herbs, and then the spirits take over one of us, allowing the person to proclaim out loud and identify what the patient is suffering from." I'm now going to play for you an excerpt of a performance of the Invocation of Spirits by Nabanji, in which two women, also witch doctors in Nabanji's community, join him. As we began documenting this event, an elder gentleman rushed into the clearing in the remote village to join the performance. He introduced himself to me quickly, saying that he was the witch doctor's father, and that he had taught his son everything he knows. He apologized for being late, explaining that he had just come from Catholic Mass. And I know that must sound funny, but in this area of the world, it's normal. I give you the text for this next video example. It ends at the point where the spirit becomes impossessed in the witch doctor, and he asked me to turn off my camera. Kindly turn off your video camera. One final video example I'd like to play today introduces Walia Suleiman, a Muslim living outside of Iganga town in eastern Uganda. Since diagnosed over 10 years ago as HIV positive after the death of his wife, Suleiman has dedicated what is left of his life to bringing education, comfort, and counseling and medical treatment to many other Muslims in his community and surrounding areas. I've met with Suleiman several times and continue to collaborate with him and intend hopefully to produce a CD of recordings of his group, PADA, to raise money for his local community. Drama and music groups led by men, women, and youths are affecting significant changes in Uganda, and perhaps no place greater than at the grassroots, local efforts. In many cases, the government has not been in a position to act, where women's groups, led by single individuals without any funding, have been most successful. It was repeatedly as surprising for the doctors with whom I work that efforts to fight the virus and disease in villages were primarily in the form of local musical responses and musical initiatives. On multiple occasions, they asked women, specifically living with HIV, why they persisted in their efforts to contribute to local interventions, why they continued to dance their disease when they had such little energy, why they made sure that their children knew the lyrics to their family songs. The answers remain profound. Ugandan women do not want other women and other children to experience what has been forced on them. And they will use whatever power, whatever spirits they can access to introduce social and political interventions, no matter how small the reward. These brief observations today represent at a very basic level the efforts of people throughout Uganda to combat the HIV virus and AIDS disease in ways in which local governments and private multinational and multilateral non-governmental organizations have largely been unsuccessful. Local and external funds rarely trickle down to the village networks that comprise the majority of the country. And foreign aid frequently contradicts the plurality of spiritual traditions that are often embraced in everyday village life. Any observations based on my field work, my field research with local health systems and musical institutions must therefore take into account a challenge issued to me by several women's groups to demonstrate the link between the recent decline in Uganda's infection rate and the grassroots efforts of local rural women's groups. Efforts to educate and heal on Western medical and religious models have proven largely expensive, unsuccessful, and inaccessible, at times even culturally inappropriate. Only when supported and encouraged by performances drawing on local musical traditions have medical and spiritual initiatives taken root and flourished in local healthcare systems, leading many to a much needed and much deserved peace of the body. Thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you so much for that, Greg. Before I ask you one or two questions, I guess a preliminary question. There must be people here who have been really quite moved by these images and by what you've been saying, and may wonder whether it's appropriate to ask how they can help with this at all. I mean, is there some simple answer to that?
There are many different answers to that question. There are many different initiatives in Nashville associated with Nashville Cares and with Vanderbilt that allow people to become either more fiscally compassionate or emotionally more compassionate. I would, if anyone is interested, I'd be happy to meet and discuss. I don't think there's any one way to address that question. There are various ways of reaching out, either physically, economically, or politically.
I mean, if there are like names of organizations and phone numbers and so on, we can put these up on the website.
Absolutely.
Attached to this this lecture series. So.
Are you accusing me of being an activist?
No, it wouldn't be an accusation if I did.
Thank you.
Quite approve. So let me ask you then. I mean, I've got so many questions, but I'll restrict myself to one or two. You know, I'm fascinated by the role of music and that you're describing here in obviously a lot of communicating of information in what I take to be a largely oral culture. Is that right?
That's correct.
So it's a way of remembering things and communicating things and so on. And I'm wondering if you see sort of parallels there with with the development of soul music in this country, in African American spirituals, and again the use of music to sort of deal with adversity. Is there a kind of obvious parallel?
And there are probably even more parallels than we've noted. The obvious parallel is communication. not speaking something and meaning something else, being able to encode, using music to communicate something that not everybody understands. But in response, I remember Mona and I moving to Africa in the early 90s, and I came with a good knowledge of the Swahili language, speaking Swahili, and I had a very large vocabulary, and I thought I knew what I was talking about. And I realized it took me months. I was using a Swahili term that that's in my dictionary, and I had learned in my Swahili classes at Brown University, and the term was muziki. And it was a perfectly legitimate term, and I thought I knew what it meant. And months after living in Tanzania, someone pointed out, you know, muziki means Western choral hymns, you know, music from Europe, you know. And then I started digging deeper and deeper, and it turns out there is no term for music in many parts of Africa because there's no way of understanding music the same way that you or I may understand music. I dug deeper, and in some parts of East Africa, there's a term called ngoma, which in my dictionary translates to drum. But that's not what ngoma means. Ngoma means the dancing, the performance, the history of the event, the social. I don't have the same connection to music. I have a very different understanding of music from my culture. In different parts of the world, music is the history. It's the way, the communicative tool. Many of these women have gone to traditional modes of music making because it's the most effective way of communicating sentiment, information, knowledge, for attracting attention. Aida says, no one's going to listen to us unless we bring out the drums. What she's saying is, the men won't listen to us unless there's a drum. And it's the men we want to listen to our messages. So they are very clever, yes, encoding messages within the traditional form of giving information, but they're saving lives, David.
I mean, one question I want to ask you, just an observation, that obviously music's used for all kinds of non-pacific purposes in tribal societies, and even in our own. I mean, martial music, the use of drums to organize armies and so on. So there's an enormous sort of field out there, which is not always directed towards peace and healing. Yeah. But I guess one question a lot of people would want to ask is, what understanding do the people that you're dealing with have of what AIDS is? I'm thinking that you could treat it quite clearly as a form of possession itself, which then is a spiritual problem, which then needs a spiritual solution. And I'm wondering whether that is part of what the traditional healer or witch doctor is assuming, and that what that connects up with, I guess, is the question of you didn't use the word drugs there in your presentation at all, and of course I'm sure a lot of people think, well, you know, the use of music can be really helpful in communicating the dangers of certain kinds of practices and so on. It can be really good in generating social solidarity, but it's not going to, I've just put this in, you know, it's not going to cure the disease, whereas we might think that some cocktail of drugs, especially when you think of places like India where they managed to get the prices of these right down by breaking patents and so on, is going to have a different sort of impact. Are these, so I've got two kinds of questions here. Do they really understand that we're talking about a virus that can be addressed with drug cocktails? Go on.
No, it's a brilliant question, and my response is, by focusing on local interventions and local knowledge of HIV, it helps me understand contemporary reactions to HIV. HIV existed for a long time before it was labeled as HIV. HIV was rampant in the Rakai district along Lake Victoria and other parts of the country for decades before it was labeled and given the medical label. So in songs, in musical traditions, very often I'm able to document the history of knowledge of AIDS, because the terms that are used for AIDS tell us how people understood and localize their understandings, whether it was frequently a punishment from God, a punishment conceptualized as a punishment from the almighty power, or whether it was a type of insect understood as an insect that eats from a jackfruit from the inside out. There are all these local ways of understanding HIV that are still used because of the heritage, the history of AIDS in the area. In Uganda, there are no ARVs that are free and available, so to even the free drugs have a cost, and you have to belong to the right clinic, and you have to have those associations in place, and they're very expensive. So what are in a world without ARVs, the virus is conceptualized and performed in a very different way. Last summer when I was going to Uganda, I was sitting in Kennedy Airport, and knowing that the Ugandan infection rate had just come down from 8 to 5%, and the infection rate in the U.S. had just gone up by 4 points in a world where we have ARVs. Our knowledge of what the virus is in our clinical way, in many ways, doesn't tell us as much as sort of the spiritual way of understanding the disease, the virus specifically. So I'm deliberately not avoiding your question because I haven't come to grips with the value of understanding one is better than the other.
Right. I mean, and it is interesting that there are people in this country who think that AIDS is a curse. And think of it like that before they think of it.
Moral stigma attached to it. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to have to, not have to, but I'm delighted we should open this discussion to the floor. We've got an opportunity to ask Greg questions. Yes, there's a lady with a stripe here. There's a mobile mic.
Thank you. My first question is, in Uganda, where your experience is, I guess, or if it's just in Uganda or other places, does this problem exist in all classes, or is it just the lower class? What about the ruling class? Or
a quick response is AIDS does not discriminate, and there's no way of. Statistically, it's very interesting that if you read government statistics, it does seem to discriminate because nobody dies of AIDS publicly. So in some ways, the upper class doesn't die of AIDS. They die of something else, and it doesn't get reported as AIDS, whereas lower. So you see the problem in that. No, AIDS does not discriminate. There's no way it doesn't make its way through different sectors of the. It just is, and it affects the rich as much as the poor. Yeah.
Also, is there any emphasis on behavior modification, that is, monogamy? I mean, there was nothing mentioned about that. Does that ever come up? That's a problematic question because there's some deep cultural understandings of polygamy, and there all these different abstinence programs being sent abroad, and the very idea of abstinence, even in our own culture, is problematic. I'm not sure I understand what abstinence means in America. So exporting this idea of abstinence has been a part of President Museveni's campaign since day one. He has encouraged what is called zero grazing, which is a localized way of understanding abstinence. And it is helpful. It is extremely helpful. And the Catholic Church has its own take on that in their efforts. So yeah, there have been efforts, absolutely, but it's not the only solution. Yeah.
What we're going to do now is going to collect a few questions and ask you, perhaps, Greg, to take notes so that we can answer them all at the end. This is our usual way of getting in more questions than we otherwise would. There's a lady over here. Yes.
My question was: are you seeing the music translate into prevention? And it takes on the behavior question. Having been raised Catholic, I know what the Catholic Church thinks, unfortunately, about prevention, about condoms. We've all read in the news the story about men think that if they have sex with a virgin, they're cured of AIDS. So are you seeing lyrics translate into, hopefully, the use of things that help to prevent the disease?
Thank you. Great. There are a couple of questions up here, and then okay, we'll start off with that one there. Yes, and then you.
I hope I'm not being obtuse. Can you just explain the significance of the last picture?
Okay, you'll get your chance.
Oh, okay. Beautiful, beautiful.
Yes, lady here.
Are they getting any medicines and needles or anything?
Where is that voice?
Oh, right
sorry.
here.
David,
they come from everywhere, anywhere. Right.
Now, do they get medicines and shots
so
and what they need, or they just let them go their own natural way?
Lady with a red cap here.
On the top of the back page, Nabangi says, singing is the main form of treatment we employ. We play drums and other instruments during the process of diagnosis to discern whether a patient has AIDS, etc., possession. Is that some type of intuitive diagnostician type of thing? Or?
Yes.
And what I have, it's not really a question. It's not really a question so much as information I wanted to share, is that there are a lot of people in Tennessee that have HIV and AIDS as well, and that will be cut off of TennCare, depending on what happens with the TennCare situation. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that, so to put that in the questions, and also to share that this Friday there's an opportunity for people here to get involved around that. There's going to be a rally that's to save TennCare and to address this. There's a gathering from 11 to noon on Friday at the 15th Avenue Baptist Church, which is at 1203 9th Avenue North. And people will be speaking and will be singing, and people who are on TennCare now and are seriously ill with all kinds of illnesses, including HIV, that are going to be cut, will be speaking. And then we'll walk down to the Bicentennial Mall, where several leaders, ministers that were leaders during the Civil Rights Movement will be singing. So this is a chance to put this in action now in this state. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I think we've only got room for two more questions. Lady here and a gentleman over here.
I was just wondering, we in the West think of ourselves as being so kind of technologically advanced. And you mentioned that this oral communication did a lot as far as bringing the statistical numbers down. Is there something we in the West, could learn from their oral traditions, which might, be of help to us?
Okay, I think the last question here, and then I know there are plenty of other questions, but Greg will stay a few minutes afterwards and talk to you.
Greg, when there's a tsunami and all these people were killed, they sent millions and millions of dollars to help the people there. And in the Sudan now, we have a lot of people from the Sudan coming to places like Fargo and Grand Forks, North Dakota, when they leave the jungles and in the deserts and end up at a place where there's snow about 11 months out of the year. And we help, they're not helping them in the Sudan, obviously. And there was one time when they were sending medicine into the area where you are to help on what is going on. What's the United States and maybe other countries doing coming in there where thousands and thousands of people are dying every day? What are we doing about that, or any other countries?
Thank you very much. Greg, I think we got you enough to play with here.
I'm going to whip through brilliant questions, and it just makes me feel so proud to just be among all of these responses. First of all, music, does it translate to does it move beyond intervention? And there are songs. If you read my book, for
just give them the title.
It's my book is coming. It's not out, unfortunately. It's coming out in October with Routledge Press. It's called "Singing for Life." It tries to document basically the songs and performances of women in Uganda. There are songs that do affect change. I have women telling me, okay, we went for an mobilization outreach effort to this village. The following day, 3 people came to our clinic and signed up for blood testing. I mean, to have your blood tested, it's an expense, and to get people there, there has to be a counselor ready for post-test counseling. They see results of people getting wanting treatment, wanting testing, one in counseling. So yes, music does translate. Music also calls into question. There's song texts in my book that say, you know, that myth about sleeping with a virgin, or the other myth about sleeping with only the seventh woman will become infected, the other six are fine. You know, yes, this is being openly addressed in the only forum available to many women, and that is in song text. So yes, there is. I can't document it, but women tell me specifically that they are seeing. Other health clinics are telling me that after an intervention, after a performance, the next day people are showing up. The shoes, well, I had a good reason for putting it up there. It was just to allow us to enter into, thank you, that was brilliant. Allowing us, these are the shoes of the children at the Good Shepherd orphanage in the middle of nowhere in Golomolo village, and they have been collected from the city where they've been abandoned. They're all HIV positive, and these are their shoes outside of their schoolroom. I just put it up there as a creative way for any response into this culture. Medicines, ARVs, it's a problematic response. This is just beautiful.
Let there be light.
This is beautiful. There are various understandings of what the U.S. has promised in their global initiative, and funding sources come and go very quickly, and ARVs that have been promised for free are now available for purchase in many parts of Uganda, and even the smallest amount is very often beyond the means of many people. Several of the gentlemen and women with whom I work, who run clinics, who run outreach efforts themselves, who need the drugs the most, can't afford it. And these are people who are trying to help other people afford the drugs. So they are there, they're costly, they're expensive, and in some countries have embraced a system where everybody gets drugs. In other countries, this is not the case yet. In regards to Tennessee and HIV status of the community here, I do what I can to be informed and involved, and I've in the past been working with outreach efforts to bring Tennessee and Uganda specifically in dialogue, and I have brought in AIDS activists from Uganda to working the community here with the assumption that they are going to learn from America, and it's always the other way around, that the community of Nashville learns so much from HIV-positive Ugandans, specifically the localized conceptualization of I'm not HIV positive, I'm living positively with HIV, and it's just that's a very African perspective of the virus. So that's one way I involve myself, is bringing people together to talk, and often wonderful music happens. Technologies. So I'm involved, I'm implicated in various technologies in Africa. I'm trying to get more involved in figuring out how we in America can respond. I'm in dialogue with other people who study HIV from different cultural perspectives, specifically American perspectives. And I'm trying to get involved with coming to terms with how different cultures can learn from technologies that are so successful elsewhere, and I would include drumming and dancing as a technology in Africa, of course. And finally, to respond to my father-in-law's question, from Fargo, North Dakota, aren't you glad you don't live there? It's a beautiful place. It's a beautiful place. The U.S., I am not going to condemn the U.S. That's not my job. A more clever response would be, I'm the U.S. and you're the U.S. If we want to be the U.S., we have to do something, and every little bit helps. So it's not always about money. Money's not going to solve everything. We can talk to different people, however, UNAIDS and the WHO, and involve ourselves more with how monies get spent and how they are allocated. And of course, Bono's efforts have been principal in getting people's attention, getting the U.S. to recognize its promises, and getting the money to go in the right places. So I think I've got everything.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. We started a minute late, and we ended a minute late. Not bad. It's fabulous. No, they're really a very good communicator. Yeah. No, there's a perfect balance of. I mean, I think images help a great deal, and the music. Perfect.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you for
That was fine. No.
not reason enough to. Brilliant. No glitches. You were on the sound. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
I really appreciate your comment.
Yeah, I'm trying to debate. We're getting a new video editing system here. I'm trying to decide whether to go Mac or PC.
Can you swing both ways if you have the Mac?